we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's webinar. So this is Monday today, and we are speaking about agility. And thank you for joining us, and happy Easter for those who celebrate today. My name is Elena Gvinyuk. I'm responsible for the Central and Eastern Europe at the SME Banking Club, and I will be your host today. And I'm glad to be joined and supported in this Agile series by John Mark Williams from Agile Business Consortium and Maria Sinusa from Integrated Consulting Group. Thank you so much for joining today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
So before we start and go to the topic, let me quickly mention organizational moments. So our webinar is scheduled for half an hour. The format of our webinars is a panel discussion, so you're welcome to type your questions right from the start. So you can type them into the chats and we will be answering at once, I think. And we are recording this webinar, so right after we finish, you will receive the link to this video. So today we decided to speak about Agile Finance. As finance is the core of each organization, and I think that this is one of the less agile areas actually at the moment in big organizations like banks, because when we do budgeting, for example, for a year and approve it, this is a really difficult thing to change it within a year. Even some business targets are changing. So let's talk about this, and John, I'm passing the word at once to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Elena. Good morning, everybody, and happy Easter for those people who celebrate Easter, and happy holiday for those people who don't. I think you're absolutely right. Agility is quite a challenge, actually, in banking, of course, in particular, for two reasons, I think, really. First of all, banks are very large organizations, with many of them with very long-standing legacy systems. And I don't just mean computer systems, I mean processes and procedures within the banks. The second thing, of course, is because banks are a very highly regulated industry, and agility within a very highly regulated industry can be a challenge. Particularly can be a challenge. So I think there's no doubt that Agile Finance is I think I would call it a valuable consideration for a bank, particularly bearing in mind that agility is a required characteristic of organizations, and the situation we're in at the moment is a clear demonstration of that. Maria, I know that you will want to say a little something about this.
Yes. So not to mention that, the financial sector is actually one of the most competitive sector that we have, alongside with telecom and some other sectors that are really impacting the digitalization. What we were discussing just before we started was like, it's not enough that the banks have all that competition starting from the fintechs, and they have the legacy and the compliance stuff on their back trying to move on, but they're also facing this kind of a disruption. It's totally uncalculated for, and that is something that might put better in perspective the idea of how are we projecting our business, how do we manage to adjust our projections in accordance to reality. And it's actually, I think, pushing like a fast forward button for everybody, regardless of banks or regardless of industry, is basically like a fast forward button for everybody. And whoever manages not to fall from the wagon is actually what will happen these days.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I like that analogy of a fast forward button. The thing is, yes, what we are going through now is an acceleration of what was happening anyway, and the fast forward button's a really good analogy for that. Thank you. Elena, do you want me to go into the presentation so we can get into the conversation?
Yes, sure. Let's go through the presentation.
Right. Well, we as it says on the slide that's on the screen, this is about Agile Finance. I think what's very important about Agile Finance is if I go to the the second slide, which shows what might be called titled the environment for business agility, might be called the 5 pillars of business, because if you see in the center of the slide, it talks about agile business strategy, and then around the slide are the 4 other elements, core elements of business functions: people, finance, operations, and marketing. And it's really important for an organization, if we think of agility as being the power to adapt and respond rapidly, it's important, therefore, for an organization to be agile in all of those areas. And obviously, we'll be covering all of those areas in the Agile Mondays. Looking at Agile Finance, one of the hardest things, I think, somebody ever asked me really was about 3 or 4 months ago, and they said, how do you define Agile Finance? What's different between Agile Finance and something else? And I thought, actually, it's not so much what's different about Agile Finance or how one does Agile Finance. It's about the role that Agile Finance plays within the organization. So if I go to the third slide, there are only 4, by the way. I go to the third slide. I've put a definition there of Agile Finance, which says the power to use strategy, tactics, and technology for competitive advantage. And when I came up with this, the person I've spoken to said, that's got nothing to do with finance. And I said, well, actually, if we think about strategy, tactics, and technology, those are all things that we deploy in an organization to try and achieve competitive advantage. And the way that we deploy them is effective or not, depending upon how we spend the resources the organization has. And those 2 vital resources are people and finance. And this week we're looking at finance. So in fact, Agile Finance is the thing that enables the organization to use strategy, tactics, and technology for competitive advantage. Immediately, you will recognize that if that's the case, then there's a requirement for finance not only to be connected with other parts of the organization, but actually to be embedded within those other parts of the organization. And I know, Maria, I know that you have some views around how closely connected finance is with the other parts of the organization and the fact that that might actually be changed.
Yeah. So I actually have 2 approaches here. The first one is how organizations start to become agile. And the idea is that usually it starts from product management, because we are thinking we need a budget in order to invest in this product. So we're going to make this agile team to launch the product, the service, whatever customer journey that we want to fix or invent and launch in the market. But most of the times, the part with finance is sort of left out. And what you have in the organization that is moving, and especially in the banks, yes, they are going from a conservative environment moving towards this, to go towards gaining agility. And then you have this new comers in the organization, like newly set up departments that are very fresh and hip and happening, and they are very agile, and a lot of resources that are invested in those departments to develop that mindset and that way of working. However, what you have is usually you have like a separation in the organization, which actually has to be tackled, especially by the senior management, because it feels like those teams that are agile teams and they are launching new products are like the coolest guys in town. And usually what it happens is that the support functions are sort of left behind, and they are like the noise that we have. Oh, we need to do that for that. They don't understand how we work. And the most that we have is maybe some training for those departments so that at least they can catch up with these teams and they can adjust their own way of working to the needs of these teams. Finance is not the only example. HR, and we'll tackle that as well, is another example of how you can fall behind with performance management while you have Agile set up in some other team. So on the one hand, what I want to make, the point I wanted to make is that you do not create the feeling of cooperation within the organization if the approach is like this, and it's actually against the very principles of agile mindset, if you want. On the other hand, I find it very difficult for people. You cannot recreate and create like small banks within a bank. And, each agile team to have finance, tax, procurement, HR, it's impossible. And it's not lucrative at the end of the day. So actually, what we've seen, like the approach, the successful approaches, and what we are also trying to discuss here right now is to try to change the background of people finance, to try to change them the job requirements that are for them. Because besides finance-related knowledge, it is more important than ever to start to have business acumen, to start to understand where the finance, the data part is important to support the business. And yeah.
Sorry, yes, I was going to say that. It's absolutely right. And I remember some years ago, I worked in a company selling computer equipment out of the UK into mainland Europe. And we sold in lots of different countries. And I remember the finance director coming to me and saying, can we sit down and can we have a chat about your sales plan and how you're going to deliver and stuff like this? And I said, yeah, sure, we can have a chat. I'm a bit surprised, though, that as the finance director, you're interested in my sales plan. And he said, well, no, I have to be interested because I've got 5,000 units I need to sell next year. And I said, what do you mean you've got 5,000 units? He said, well, I'm the finance director. I'm part of the business. I need to have the same commitment to selling those units as you do. And he was years ahead of his time, thinking in terms of the rest of the organization. So, yeah, reinforcing that idea of connection between the two.
Yes, indeed. That is a really very good example of finance people getting into the business. Yeah, and supporting the business right now. I
think about agility and how we apply agility to ourselves. And I think about, I want to become more agile. If I was a bank, I might say, okay, well, I want this team to become agile or that team to become agile. If I want to become agile as a person, I don't say, right, I'm going to become agile. Start with my feet. I'll make my feet agile first of all, and then I'll do my left arm. I'll make my left arm agile. That isn't how agility works. Agility is a generic condition, and actually the whole body or the whole bank needs to become agile. Now, that doesn't mean that every part of the bank needs to become agile in the same way at the same time, because agility is a condition that means different things to different parts of a body or a bank. And it might mean flexibility, it might mean endurance, it might mean strength. There are many things. However, we always need to think of it as a generic condition. And finance is important because finance is the one part of an organization that reaches into every single other part, everywhere. None of an organization can possibly perform without finance. And this is why Agile Finance is so important.
Yes, totally agree with what you said. And I liked your comment about not everybody needs to be the same, because then you also have the situation in which people are getting so overly excited about involving everybody. Now we are collaborating more, we are communicating more. And then the extreme goes from not sharing almost anything to share whatever goes in our mind and actually wasting our times. So basically in every organization, you need to find that balance of relevance. Where is relevant for everybody to be? Where can each function have a relevant contribution? And in terms of finance, actually putting things in perspective for them and trying to understand how can they support the launch of that product. What is the definition of value from business perspective, from customer perspective, and trying to get finance people to work together with agile people, with the product people in agile teams, with product owners, if you want, then you would have really some constructive discussions going on, because then you would have a finance knowledge that is translated into the business side for the definition of value. And then you also have from the business side translated into finance the reasoning for why we are doing all this. What kind of data do we require in order to make decisions in our little business cases that we need to do every day in order to define what is customer value or not? So I see these roles coming very, very close towards the business and towards more in the sense from moving from data processing that is more and more the subject of RPA these days, moving towards assuming ownership of data, understanding what is meaningful, and coming with various angles to business so that business would understand better and would have better arguments for the decision that they make. Not to, it's nice, the business intuition, to have a nose for something, but statistically speaking, we are not all Steve Jobs, and probability of being is quite low. So we need some numbers.
That's absolutely right. Yes, and as somebody, which I am, somebody who has great faith in his intuition, which I do. I nevertheless recognise that actually very often the data says something different. And I think that the point that you made, actually, Maria, about support and looking at how the other parts of the organization can support the agile outcome that the organization wants to achieve, it reminded me of the little children. When watching little children play a game of football before they've ever had any coaching, when they play a game of football, somebody kicks the ball, they all run after the ball. Every one of them will, they'll charge after the ball together in a tight little group, and they'll follow the ball all over the place, which is not actually how football games get won. So when they get coached, the coach will explain to each of them, actually, if somebody on our side has the ball, this is what you can do to support a successful outcome from that possession. And I think that's the sort of analogy that might work with coaching in an agile organization. So rather than having everybody wanting to be part of the agile team and wanting to collaborate with everybody else, actually, let's just step back and say, okay, we're going to be agile in this part of the bank. What do the other parts of the bank need to get on board with in order that the whole bank can benefit from the work of that agile team? So it's quite interesting.
I really liked your examples with this team, because you can actually look at finance as a goalkeeper or the quarterback. The ones are in defense, because we don't want. And actually, you don't get to have so many stars, yes, as the ones that are on the offensive position. But they are just as important, because regardless of the stars that you have in your team, if you do not have a proper goalkeeper, it's actually you're going to lose the game. It's very nice. Yeah.
Absolutely right. I always used, because I played in defence when I played football at school, so I always used to say defence is much more important than attack.
You have to build up arguments.
Any four can score goals if there's no goalkeeper. That's okay. I've got one more slide, which I think feeds quite nicely into this conversation. So I'll just touch on that, if I may. This is the last slide, and this just describes the features or the characteristics of an agile finance function. And you'll see on the slide, I've got a logo there in the middle for Beyond Budgeting. Beyond Budgeting is the organization based in Sweden, in Scandinavia. It was born in Scandinavia about 20 years ago, and they are the source and depository of the best information around everything to do with agile finance. If you Google Beyond Budgeting, you will discover that actually it's widely utilized as an agile finance function certainly within Scandinavia and increasingly beyond, and is more and more known internationally now. And I think it would be well worth having a look at that. And this slide is taken from the principles that Beyond Budgeting put together for agile finance. And it looks at three core functions, or three core elements to an agile finance function. The first one is timescales. You mentioned earlier on, Maria, about budgets, annual budgets and stuff like this. Agile finance doesn't have annual budgets. It has rolling forecasts. They might be rolling 3-month forecasts or rolling 2-month forecasts. The important thing is, because it's based around the principle of let's try and achieve some agility, we recognize that it's actually not possible to forecast a year ahead, because even 4 months ago, nobody knew that we would be where we are now. So if we had rolling 3-month forecasts, we can immediately begin to alter our financial behaviors in response to what's happening in the marketplace. So instead of annual budgets, have rolling forecasts. I'll mention the other two now, although we'll talk in more detail about those in a future date. The second one is trust. instead of the leadership of the organization saying, okay, this is what we've decided the annual budget will be, this is what you will have, and this is what you will spend, and this is what we want you to get for it, actually, they will say, based on your 3-month rolling forecasts, okay, this is what we'll allot you. We'll allot that money to you. Not we will tell you how to spend it. We will actually say to you, you told us this is what you need, this is what's for, off you go. If you need more, and there's a good reason for it, come back and tell us. And then the third thing, and this fits very nicely with the trust, because devolving, especially in something like a bank, devolving resources to somebody closer to the front line is very high risk for senior management because they lose control. Okay, then we add in transparency so that actually, instead of having 3-month reports, we have real-time visibility of what's going on in the bank. Now, banks, of course, because they are massively data-driven, very often will have almost real-time visibility of a lot of the functions within the bank. Certainly the trading functions, certainly the P&Ls and various divisions will be very often easily accessible. However, this is about having transparency in everything within the organization, including HR. The idea, for example, of instead of having a 30-page expenses policy, just saying travel responsibly, and then making everybody's expenses transparent within the organization so that everybody can see what everybody else is spending. So we trust, and actually we make transparent. So timescales. Let's not have annual budgets, let's have rolling forecasts, because that allows us to respond rapidly to market movements. Let us trust the people who are closer to the customer to determine how much actually needs to be spent doing things. And then let us make everything transparent so that we can see, actually, if this part of the team or this team within the bank is getting more value out of what they're spending, maybe they can share that with other people. So those are the 3 really fundamental principles of beyond budgeting. And I thought we might talk on the timescales one first of all. So, Maria.
Mm-hmm. On the timescales, I usually give this example, and everybody, they usually give the example with the companies that I work with, which are the profile is like multinationals, and everybody starts to roll their eyes because they really can agree with the scenario. So basically, if you have a financial year starting in January, ending in December, basically you are preparing with the forecast somewhere around August. You start to do the budgets, yes, yep. And then you do bottom up, and then you do top down, and then we negotiate. And then after we manage to negotiate, already December has finished, so might be somewhere there, January or finishing up. And then you have the KPI setting based on the targets that you set for yourself. And this negotiation ends with everybody being relieved that they finally managed to put them in the system in March. Because this is life in our organization. And then what you have at the end of March, you actually have the actuals of the first trimester. So then what do you do? And in the corporate game, you just inserted the KPI in the system. You cannot just adjust them 1 week after. So what you have, the story goes even further for another quarter, in which you're saying, okay, we will adjust it to June, whatever happened, if it didn't happen as we expected. And then in the second quarter, you are actually running also to get the client, but also to defend what you forecasted, because you cannot really have such a big difference from your initial planning. And so occupying your mind not only on how to deliver to the client something relevant, but also on guarding a bit yourself, yes, in the organization, to explain what happened. And I find there is a huge disconnect between large organizations that are saying we need to become more agile, and we are implementing this, we are working on this agile mindset, and we need to have more business agility. While at the same time, this dialogue, it happens at the same time. Everybody understands the need for that, But then it's like all of a sudden I remove the agility hat and I put the other hat that I know. And we talk about budget now. And no, the budget is fixed. It's a bit of, we can improvise here, but we don't play with the numbers like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This
There are two really important things here. One is around that variance, we either spend an awful lot of time making up the excuses or the reasons why we vary so much from what the budget said, or actually we will spend time trying to manipulate the numbers so that they are not that much different from the variance, because we get into trouble if there's a large variance from the budget, because of course the budget was sent down from on high with some kind of mythical validity or truth attached to it. The second thing is when we do things like annual budgets, one of the things that happens is we know if we don't spend the budget and produce credible results from it, we won't get the money next year. So actually,
yes.
First, everybody bids for more money than they need because they know that there's going to be a fight about it, so they'll get knocked down. Secondly, everybody at the end of the year spends as much money as possible and tries to make it look as though it's actually producing results in order that they'll be able to bid for the same next year. And this, this is, we know this is a problem in the public sector because the way public sector finance works. It's also a problem in large corporates, no doubt about it. So those two things, trying desperately to defend a variance that was set back in August of the year before, and secondly, trying to defend our budget for next year, are two things that probably use up almost half the time of some managers, I would think, rather than actually delivering for the business. So yeah, very, very good points.
I have a question actually to both of you here. As you are both cooperating and working with different organizations, not only from the banking sector, but from the different, do you have some example in your mind, maybe either of some concrete company or maybe some sector or industry, which is really where this finance function is really can be an example of agile finance? I mean, that this function is really all becoming, have a good progress in becoming agile, because like the problem of budgeting in big organizations we discussed already. The other side of the story is, for example, if we go to the SMEs, so for small businesses, very often they don't budget at all, they don't plan at all their finance, and this is another problem. I mean, and this is another case. So just my question is, do you have in mind some company or maybe the industry right now which is really becoming agile in their finance functions, if you have?
Yeah, I can give you two examples actually from beyond budgeting. Actually, if one talks to them, there are, as I mentioned, they were born in Scandinavia. A number of Scandinavian organisations, some very large ones. Volvo, I think, is often quoted as an example. Equinor, which used to be Statoil, the state oil company, where I think the beyond budgeting principles were actually born, I think, in Statoil when it was still called Statoil. So there are those companies. What is important, I think, there is because they are vast companies, they will be operating in a financial agility approach in parts of their organizations, probably at certain layers and stuff like this. How far it feeds down into the whole organization, it's difficult to know. And bear in mind that they are, of course, in completely different sectors. Volvo in a luxury goods sector, which nevertheless has very high volume and has a value chain, and Equinor or Statoil, as they were, operating in a project-driven sector where the value chain is very different and very intermittent. So I think each of those, if one had a look at each of those, it would be quite interesting. The other thing I'll say is in SMEs, in smaller companies, they don't have, of course, they don't have budgeting processes and finance teams and stuff like that. Smaller companies are more naturally agile. And because they have to be, because they operate very close to break even or closer to break even than most large companies, and because they are closer to the customer as well. And when I say closer to break even, the example I'll give is a very large car company, not Volvo, it was Ford, I think, in Europe, announced a few years ago that they'd made their first profit in Europe for 10 years. there's no SME that I can think of that could run for 10 years without making a profit. So financial agility is inherent in smaller businesses, or they die. And that's what differentiates them from larger companies. Maria, you might have some examples, I think.
I was just about to say the same thing for SMEs. You don't need to be that structured to have that kind of a big corporate governance and hierarchical structure in your company, because you simply cannot afford it. And if you do not prove to have business agility, you simply die. You're just taken out by the competition, or the clients stop buying from you. What I wanted to add from the comment that you made regarding large organizations, what I see more and more the trend working in practice is the trend of building finance business partners within the finance function. So then you would have a person in the finance that is like the first step that is made towards this direction, because finance starts to understand the need for being more closer to the business. And actually you cannot be closer to all the parts of the business. For example, in a bank, it's there are quite different ways of approaching things, from retail to large corporates. But you need a support function that understands the specifics of your business segment. And because they understand those specifics, they also start to understand better the client and also the business challenges that they face. So you might have within the same bank a finance business partner for retail who suddenly realizes that a certain approach to data is required, and which will not be the same for large corporates. So this is the way finance can get closer and closer, not necessarily be included in the agile teams, but having this kind of business partners to act for the agile teams.
That's really clever, because we think about the success of HR business partners as a cohort within large organizations, and certainly within banks, replicating that connectivity with various parts of the bank seems like not just an extraordinarily good idea. It seems like an idea that should have been thought of decades ago in a lot of ways, especially in banks. I think that's a tremendous step forward, and is probably a step in the direction of agility. Because the more that the bank can make use of the finance function, and not just the finance function understand the differences in the way that the parts of the bank operate, but also banks start to understand the ways in which finance can contribute to successful outcomes in different parts of the bank. I think that would be very interesting, and certainly we as the Agile Business Consortium would be very interested in talking not only to you, of course, but to banks who are pushing out this finance business partner role in a way that's founded on agility as the outcome. I'll be really interested in that.
Yes. Thank you. Actually, we are running off our time for today's episode. So as we agreed that the next elements like trust and transparency we will be discussing next Monday to continue the topic of Agile Finance. And John Maria, if you would like to summarize very shortly right now today's topic and the beyond budgeting element of the time scales, you are welcome to do so. We have like 1-2 minutes.
Yeah, my summing up would be very, very straightforward, which is stop obsessing about annual budgets. Nobody can see that far in the future. That's it.
That's a very good wrap up for the idea of beyond budgeting. Honestly, impossible to add anything better.
Okay, yes, great episode. Thank you very much for joining today, this Monday, and raising this really very important and I think crucial topic as for now for the banks. Thank you, and see you next Monday.
Thank you.
Bye.